When I was 7, my world was simple. It revolved around the small things: a new toy, a favorite snack, or the sound of my mother's laughter echoing through the house. But that world started to crumble the day I found my mother crying in the kitchen. At first, I thought it was something minor. Maybe she hurt herself while cooking or had a bad day. But it wasn't anything that simple. The first time I saw my mother and father argue, it wasn't about money or bills. My father came home late, the smell of perfume lingering on his clothes. My mother confronted him, her voice trembling as she asked, "Who is she?" I stood by the doorway, hidden from their sight, but close enough to hear every word. My father didn't deny it. Instead, he laughed, a bitter sound that echoed in the small kitchen. "It's none of your business," he said, pushing past her to the living room. That night, I crawled into bed with my mother, holding her as she silently cried. I didn't understand what was happening, but I knew something was wrong. She whispered to me, "Everything's gonna be all right, sweetheart," but her voice lacked conviction. As the years went by, it became a routine. My father would come home late, sometimes not at all. My mother would confront him, they would argue, and I would watch from the sidelines, helpless. Sometimes my father would show up with flowers, acting like nothing had happened. He would hug and kiss my mother in front of me, trying to pretend like everything was normal. But the bruises on her emotions were always there, visible to me in ways I couldn't yet fully comprehend. There were nights when my father was affectionate, almost as if he was trying to make up for something. He'd sit on the couch with my mother, wrapping his arm around her, kissing her forehead. I watched as she stiffened under his touch, her eyes distant. Even at that young age, I knew she was trying to hold it all together for me. Then there were the nights when anger would consume our home. My father would yell, throwing accusations at my mother, twisting reality to make it seem like she was the problem. I would lie in bed, covering my ears with a pillow, praying for the silence to return. But there was one night that stands out, a night that changed everything. I was 13, old enough to understand more than I wanted to. My father came home late, as usual. My mother was waiting in the living room, her hands shaking as she clutched a picture of us, our family, back when things were good. She confronted him again, and this time it was different. My father didn't just brush her off. He got angry, really angry. He accused her of being paranoid, of imagining things. His voice was loud, sharp, and it cut through the air like a knife. My mother didn't back down. She shouted back, years of pain and frustration pouring out in her words. I stood at the top of the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. I wanted to run down, to scream at them to stop, but I was frozen, rooted to the spot by fear. My father suddenly lunged at my mother, grabbing her by the shoulders and shaking her. He was yelling, his face twisted with rage, and I saw my mother's resolve crumble in an instant. She started to cry, not the silent tears I was used to, but loud, heart-wrenching sobs. My father let go of her, disgust written all over his face. He turned to leave, and I thought it was over. But then he saw me. For a moment, our eyes met, and I saw something flicker in his expression. Guilt, maybe, or regret. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared. He turned and stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind him. I ran to my mother, who had collapsed onto the floor, still crying. I hugged her tightly, whispering that it would be okay, even though I didn't believe it. She held me close, her tears soaking my shirt. "I'm so sorry," she kept saying, over and over again. That night, I realized something that would stick with me for the rest of my life. My mother was trapped. Trapped by her love for a man who didn't deserve it. Trapped by the fear of being alone, by the need to protect me from the harsh reality of our lives. As I grew older, I learned to detach myself from the situation. My father continued his affairs, and my mother continued to turn a blind eye for my sake. I focused on school, friends, anything that could take me away from the nightmare that was my home. But the damage was done. The relationship between my parents had poisoned the way I saw love, trust, and relationships. I became distant, wary of getting too close to anyone. I didn't want to end up like my mother, weak, dependent, and broken. The climax came on the day of my high school graduation. My father didn't show up, of course. My mother was there, but she was only a shell of the woman she once was. I gave my valedictorian speech, looking out into the crowd, but my eyes kept returning to her. She was smiling, but it was forced, and I could see the sadness behind her eyes. After the ceremony, I found her sitting alone in the car, staring out the window. I sat beside her, and for a long time, neither of us said anything. Finally, she turned to me and said, "I'm proud of you. You know that?" I nodded, tears stinging my eyes. "I know, Mom. I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm sorry for everything. You deserve better." I couldn't hold it in any longer. "Why did you stay?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Why didn't you leave him?" She looked at me, her eyes filled with so much pain that it took my breath away. "Because I loved him," she said simply, "and because I didn't want you to grow up without a father." I shook my head, tears streaming down my face. "But look at what it's done to you, to us." She reached out and took my hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "I know," she said, her voice breaking. "I know, and I'm sorry." In that moment, I realized that my mother wasn't weak. She was strong in her own way, enduring years of pain for the sake of someone she loved. But her strength had come at a great cost, and I knew that I would never be the same because of it. Years later, I moved away from home, putting as much distance between myself and my past as I could. My father eventually left for good, disappearing from our lives as easily as he had entered them. My mother and I tried to rebuild what was left of our relationship, but the scars ran too deep. I swore to myself that I would never let anyone have that kind of power over me, that I would never let love make me blind. But deep down, I knew that I was still that little girl, standing at the top of the stairs, watching her world fall apart, powerless to stop it. And that's the weight I carry, the silence that follows me wherever I go. The silence of all the things that were never said, and the pain that will never truly go away.